Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this video, as we continue on in our journey through material from Chapter 8, we look at the very important topic of employee motivation. And one of the topics, of course, when we talk about motivation and we think of the broader topic of leadership, again, I want to reinforce the principle that you cannot really be an efficient, adequate, or even a great leader if you don't understand what drives your people, what motivates your people. And so in this particular lecture, we start out our look at this topic by considering what others historically have thought and written about motivation, especially motivation at work. And so first of all, we can see from this first slide just a basic definition. Motivation is understood to be the set of forces that cause people to behave in certain ways. Everyone has a set of motivating factors, a set of motivating forces, and they're simply unique and different for every one of your employees. This is one of the things to notice, is that you may have two workers working side by side and get significantly different results out of each of them. Why is that? Well, you may find one worker is deeply driven to be the first to arrive and the last to leave, and every day to give very best and most effort to make sure that the work is done, the product or the service is delivered to the customer in an excellent way, a consistently excellent way from bell to bell. Whereas the worker working right next to that person may be only motivated to deliver the very least that is adequate in order to keep his job and keep his paycheck coming in from month to month. What accounts for these broad differences in performance? Many times it is individual unique differences in employee motivation, and that's really what we're looking at today. Now, the very first thing we want to consider then is historically, what have others written and thought of in terms of motivation? Because quite frankly, we have been thinking about this in business for a very, very long time. In early theory and thinking about behavioral motivation, you can see there on the slide, the very first classical theory of motivation was advanced by Frederick Taylor in the Scientific Management School. And essentially, he proposed a theory that said that workers are really only motivated by one thing, and that is money, financial rewards, the paycheck. And that if you could pay them more, they would work harder, and if you paid them less, they would not work so hard. That people were only driven by money. As a result, for decades, management thought only revolved around what is the appropriate level of financial reward to offer to workers in order to get the optimum level of effort out of them and the highest level, acceptable level of performance. That's the classical theory of motivation. It wasn't until 1925 that researchers at Harvard, doing experimental research with workers working for General Electric, did we really begin to understand something broader and additional to the premise that workers were motivated by money. And you see that, the second point on this slide. The Hawthorne effect, as the text describes it, the tendency for productivity to increase when workers believe they are receiving special attention from management. Now, there's more to it than simply that if you feel your manager is paying you special attention, you work harder. There's more to it than that, although that's the main thing brought out in the textbook. But I think it's worth at least chatting about the Hawthorne studies a little bit more to understand the full nuance of this Hawthorne effect. And you can see there, Hawthorne studies from 1927 to 1932, led by Elton Mayo at Hawthorne. And they were researchers from Harvard working at Hawthorne for Western Electric. The company eventually was to become General Electric, and it was really two studies. So the first study was on a group of women who were building telephone relay assemblies for General Electric. And the idea was, remember, researchers were still working under the premise of the classical theory of motivation. And so what these researchers wanted to determine was, if we provided additional benefits, rewards, to a group of workers, would that affect their performance? In other words, in the spirit of, if you just give them the right recipe of rewards, they'll work harder. They wanted to figure out what was the right recipe of rewards. And so they separated these groups of women building telephone assemblies into two groups, a test group and a control group. And the first thing they did was with the test group was, well, let's give them a longer break during their workday and see if that motivates them to higher performance. And so they gave them a longer break. Then they took the break away and made it back the normal period. And then they said during the break, let's give them some food during the break. They gave them food. Then they took the food away. And then they shortened their workday by 30 minutes and then brought it back to the normal time. And then they actually took the level of illumination in the room, the light in the room, and they increased the level of light, and then they reduced it to its normal level to see what would happen. All right? Now, here's the interesting results of this fiddling around with elements in these women's work environment. All right, so they increased the duration of breaks, and performance went up. And then they decreased the level, the duration of the breaks back to the normal level, and performance went up. And so they gave them food for their break, and performance went up. And then when they took the food away from their break, performance went up again. And they played with the light, and they increased the light, and performance went up. And when it went down, performance still went up. And then they stopped the entire experiment and said, what the devil's going on here? Why is it that performance is increasing no matter what level of reward that we give these workers? What's going on? So they sat down and they asked them and said, wait a minute, we're going to suspend the experiment. Tell us why you are working harder. And they got back a very interesting response from these women. And the response was essentially this. No one really ever cared about what we did, but through this entire time, we've had all these people in lab coats with clipboards asking us questions. It made us feel special, so we worked harder because we felt we were special. Now that was unexpected, right? Because remember, back in this day, they thought the only thing that motivated employees was financial reward or some variation thereof. And here, wait a minute, these workers have feelings, and their feelings and how they feel about acknowledgement and their opinion mattering and their responses mattering, that increases their performance. Now, we may accept that these days as sort of, well, of course that, but back then this was the very first time they'd actually thought of this. All right? Now, there's also another interesting second half to the Hawthorne studies that's not always talked about. So we should talk about that. And you can see on the slide the 2 points I've given you, play with the light and play with the money. So the second half of the Hawthorne studies has to do with playing with the money. And that is that they had a group of men that were building switching equipment for Western Electric, and they divided them into two groups, a test group and control group. And here's what they did. They set piecemeal rewards in place for the men. In other words, if you produced at this baseline level, you would get a certain level of pay. But if you produced above that level, you would get bonuses based on incrementally how much more that you produced in the baseline. So it sounds obviously very much like a branch of scientific management. People are only motivated by money, right? You pay them more, you're going to get greater performance from them. And here's what they found. Very, very interesting. Very quickly, the group brought their performance to average out at what they needed to be, what the baseline was. And then what you would see is that one or two workers would bring their level of performance up above, and then immediately, almost immediately, it would go back down to the average. And then over here, someone would start to bring their performance up and get a little bit of a bonus, and then boom, it would go back down. What was happening? Well, they sat down and talked to the workers, and what had happened was essentially this. The workers had sort of silently, tacitly agreed, we're going to, as a group, we're all going to get a little bonus, but if you perform too much, you're going to make the rest of us look bad, so they would be basically slapping that dude back down to get in line with what was agreed on as a level of performance. Now, what does that mean? The conclusion, one of the conclusions that Hawthorne came back with was essentially this. Not only, the first example, play with the light, if you give workers special attention, they're going to feel better about themselves and perform better, but also peer pressure and group pressure means a lot more to people's performance, sometimes even than financial reward. Sometimes people will be motivated so much by just wanting to get along well with the other people in the work group, they will bring their performance in line to not make everyone else look bad. It's interesting findings out of this, right? Some surprising stuff, at least at the time, surprising stuff that they hadn't anticipated on uncovering out of their research. And so one of the things that comes out of the Hawthorne studies was a migration in our thought away from simply thinking that people are motivated by money to understanding there are different factors involved than just financial reward. Now, as a result, what ended up happening over time was managers began developing thought that essentially went along two primary lines. And what we meant by that is essentially, as you can see on the slide, that the theory developed that workers basically fell into either one group or another. In other words, managers looked at their life managing and said, I'm a theory X kind of person. In other words, I basically believe that generally speaking, people are lazy and uncooperative and they don't like work except to get paid. That's theory X. Other managers developed who said, I don't really believe that about my people. Instead, what I believe is that people are naturally energetic, they are growth-oriented, they're self-motivated, and they're actually interested in being productive. And so as you sort of see here, these are two significantly different ways to manage people, two significantly different underlying fundamental premises that a manager brings into the equation. And that's really the question. As a manager, do you generally believe that your people are naturally lazy and uncooperative, or do you believe that people generally are self-motivated, interested in being productive, interested in growth, naturally energetic, and just some other stuff gets in the way of their production? Well, even before I go to the next slide, I want to ask you, if you had a choice, would you rather work for a theory X manager, or would you rather work for a theory Y manager? Well, I think the answer should be clear, right? If I asked for a show of hands, y'all ought to be raising your hand for the theory Y manager, and if any of you raised your hand for theory X, it means you just weren't paying attention, right? So what else can we say? Here we are is a table out of the textbook, table 8.1, that generally speaking, theory X managers believe people are lazy, believe people lack ambition and dislike responsibility, that people are self-centered, that people resist change, people are gullible, and generally not bright. Wow, there's a mouthful, right? Whereas, on the other side, theory Y managers generally think people are energetic, people are ambitious, they seek responsibility, that people can be selfless and thoughtful of others, people want to contribute to business growth and change, and people are generally intelligent if you just give them a chance. Now, you can tell, these are two significantly different ways to look at the very people you manage. And here's the thing, how does someone end up as a theory X or a theory Y manager? Well, I would tell you this, I don't think any manager out there gets up and goes out into the world saying, I am going to start my day out thinking that generally people are lazy, people don't have ambition, they're self-centered, they don't want to work except I give them a pay. Generally speaking, theory managers don't start out as theory X managers, do they? I would suggest that managers end up to be theory X managers if they spend some time managing a work crew who sort of proves theory X to them and frustrates them and disappoints them, and they're just a drag to manage. And this is really one of the things that happens to young managers. Young managers start out sort of bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and hoping for the very, very best. And then over time, as they're disappointed by the people who work for them, they get perhaps a bad apple in the bunch, and they get more and more cynical about what it means to lead and manage people. And then over time, they end up believing all people are lazy, lack ambition, etc. I don't think it needs to stay that way, though. I truly do believe that even folks who are sort of tempted to become Theory X managers, that they can see from another perspective that not all people are like that, and that their work as their life as leaders and managers doesn't need to be a Theory X kind of a job. Nevertheless, these are two very important distinctions to make, some very important fundamental concepts and theories about motivation. We'll continue on with this discussion in the next lecture.